Hi, everyone. Welcome to your first block at Cornell. We're glad you're here with us. My name's Glenn Freeman, and I teach in the Department of English and Creative Writing. And I'm going to talk with you for a few minutes about this book, Native Guard by Natasha Trethewey. I wanted to make a few comments about poetry in general first. Some of you probably read poetry and feel very comfortable with it. Many of you, I'm assuming, though, are not so comfortable with it. For whatever reasons, that's a fairly normal reaction. And so maybe easier said than done, but I would say try to not let that word, capital P, poetry, get in your way of engaging with these poems. I wanted to respond to a comment that I hear over and over and over, which is, why don't poets just say what they mean? And I have a couple thoughts to share. The first is that poetry, to me, is as much about how something is said as what's being said. Doesn't mean we shouldn't pay attention to what's being said, but that the structure, the form, the way the poem and language are put together are integral to the experience. Poets want to create an experience rather than just tell us about an experience. And all those elements to go together to try to put us in a particular experience, or give us a particular experience. So it's not that there's some message that we can say that we then put all these other elements around. It's that you can't strip them apart. So, poets are thinking about the shape of language and how that constructs experience. I would also suggest that poetry is largely about exploration. We hear about poetry as expression, and it certainly is, but it's also a way of uncovering or discovering our thoughts. Most poets do not start out knowing what they're going to say, so that I could just tell you. It's rather that in the process of exploring language and structure, we make discoveries, and that's the poem. Because of that process, poetry is very conducive to ambiguity, uncertainty. It's very different than, say, journalism, which is trying to give us objective facts that can just be said. But it's a rich way to explore the complexities of experience and think about them in different ways. And because of that, to me, one of the important things to keep in mind is the way that poetry invites your participation. It's not just telling you something. It's giving you material that you also have to think through and be part of the process of making meaning. Doesn't mean that any meaning we can just interpret a poem however we want. It does mean that we're part of the process. We are engaged with the poem in a very different way than, say, an objective piece of writing. That said, Natasha Trethewey is sometimes very straightforward, sometimes journalistic. She has very specific personal and social stories that she does want us to know. And so we shouldn't pay attention to the content. The content is very, very important. But the form, the shape of these poems is also tied to that meaning. Much of her background comes out in these poems, but a couple things to know about her just to make sure it's kind of clear. Trethewey was born in Gulfport, Mississippi in 1966. In 1966, it was illegal to have an interracial marriage. Her parents were interracial, so it was illegal for them to be together. They went to Ohio to get married and then came back to Mississippi, where she was born, and then later moved to Canada. Her parents divorced when she was fairly young, and her mother remarried, and her stepfather, when Trethewey was 19, her stepfather killed her mother. That experience is what confirmed to Trethewey that she would be a poet. She says, I turned to poetry to make sense of what happened. So it's a way for her to process that experience. And Native Guard is her third book. She's published more since then, but that was her third book. And even then, you can see that it's still at the center of her poetic project. Just this year, she published a memoir that's all about her mother and her mother's death. So it remains part of her struggles as an artist. She served as poet laureate, which is a position appointed by the U.S. Library of Congress, and it's basically our national poet. They serve 2-year terms and serve as consultant to the Library of Congress and do public outreach throughout the country in the name of poetry. But so she's reached a very high level of acclaim, and I think Native Guard shows why. I think it's a stunning collection. It's rich with very important sort of questions about who we are as Americans in particular. I think the book is largely a question of, or a struggle with, questions of identity. You know, she's thinking about what it means to be mixed race in such a divided country, thinking about what it means to be an American that has racial division and tension throughout its history and sort of at its core, and posing that question to us as well. What does it mean to be an American with this as our kind of one of our core experiences, to have this division at the center of our experience? There's a lot about the book I could talk about with you. I'm just going to sort of raise one sort of big question or aspect of her work to think about, and that's her use of formal elements in these poems. Throughout the book, she uses traditional poetic structures. By that, I mean poetic structures that are handed down through generations. So, for instance, she uses sonnets throughout the book. I'm sure most of us, at least, have some sense of what a sonnet is. I don't want to go into the details, but this very strongly European American sort of standard of poetry. You know, what does that mean? Why does she turn into a form like that? A form that you may not have heard of. Some of you may, but may not. It's less known than a sonnet. And this is a poem, if you look at King Cotton, this poem is called a villanelle. And a villanelle is very, very tricky in terms of its guidelines. It's basically based on 2 lines that repeat themselves through the poem. The first and third lines of the poem come back as the ending of every other stanza, and then the very end of the poem. So, and she varies them a little bit, but it keeps coming back. So the great bales of cotton rise up from the ground. The great bowls of cotton risen up from the ground. Those great bales of cotton rising up from the ground, and great bales of cotton rise up from the ground. So that's repeated. The first line is repeated. There is a rhyme scheme. So you see down, ground, town, down. And then the middle lines also all rhyme: arch, march, countermarch, starch. It's a very confining, constricting kind of form. But I mentioned earlier that you can't separate form from the meaning of a poem, what the poem is saying. So here we have a poem of this great display of patriotism. We've got the president coming in, we've got flags everywhere, we've got the band, a parade. It's this great pomp and circumstance, you know, and the form, there is this kind of formal sense to this repetition. There's a kind of musical effect too of band and parade created by such intense repetition. So that, to my mind at least, the shape of the poem, the kinds of repetition, are part of, or create the experience of, this grandiose, patriotic moment. And buried in there, though, is this moment for the president who will walk through the arch, bound for the future, his back to us. You know, who is his back to? Who's getting left out of this? If not mostly the people who actually made this kind of economic boom happen. It is a case of what this form, it's not just form put onto some other content. The form is part of what the poem is saying. Um, she does turn though also to forms that are outside of the European American kind of poetic tradition. She has the blues in this book. She has, I'll point to another form that's kind of very central to the book, I think, in a way, and that's this poem, Miscegenation. And miscegenation refers to her parents, interracial relationship. Uh, and the form of this poem is called a ghazal, Ghazal. And the ghazal is a very old Arabic form that was then adopted into Persian poetic traditions. It became a very central uh, sort of part of that culture. And then it spread to the Southeast after that. In America, there's not a real ghazal tradition. There are poets that write in ghazals, particularly since the 1960s, but it remains a form that is outside of our sort of center. Um, the shape of it is these two-line stanzas, couplets, that are each grammatically and in terms of sense self-contained. So each one can kind of stand on their own. Each one ends with the same word or phrase. She ends with just the word Mississippi. Sometimes it'll be a phrase. Traditionally, there is a rhyme right before that, so somewhere within the second line. She does not do that. But she has a rhyme at the end of the first line. So name, same, name, even repeating the words. The ghazal allows for, since each couplet can stand on its own, the idea is that the couplets can also be very disconnected. Hers are she starts out telling a story and then they kind of move away. But a ghazal, can cover lots of ground, but then the idea is that those different ideas, those fragments, are held together by the formal quality of repeating sounds and phrases, or sounds and words. The other tradition of the ghazal is to refer to the poet's own name in the last couplet. So she refers to Natasha. So we have these kind of fragments, and we have different places: Mississippi, Ohio, Canada. We have William Faulkner. We have Jesus. We have War and Peace. We have a Russian name, even though, as she says, she's not. All these kinds of pieces, right, that are put together by, the name Mississippi, or these repeated words, of which name seems to be an important one, since she's thinking about her Russian name. I'm going to suggest that in some ways, this is what she's really doing throughout the book, which is thinking about our kind of her personal fragmented identity, and our fragmented national identity, and looking at trying to weave together different cultural traditions, poetic traditions, and thinking about how do they tie together? Is there some way to have an identity? And in this case, even her own name, which means Christmas child, but she was born in Easter, her name kind of separates herself from her own experience, which we see throughout the book again and again, ways in which she's divided in a similar way that the country is divided, that she's looking at historically and today. So I think she's using form to really interesting ways to think about sort of cultural traditions and ways in which we can envision or not an American identity. So something to think about as you read these. Like I say, I think it's a really pretty amazing book. I think the poems reward kind of spending time with. The more I read them, the more I get out of them. And so I hope that you enjoy them and find a way to let them sort of come to life as you read them. So thanks for listening for a few minutes, and have a great block, everyone.